So our final speaker today is our outgoing president, Lynne Farrell.
I'm not going to talk about murder, most Florid. I'm going to talk 3 years ago. I stood here as I was your new president, and I gave a little introduction. And one of the things I said is we were doing our strategy, which is probably a bit boring, but I stressed the word resilience in that. I'm glad to see that you are a resilient group of people, otherwise you wouldn't be here. I'm going to start with thanking you all for coming, because we have people from the far west, from Galway, from the south coast, from, unfortunately, not from Shetland, but he was with us in spirit, I'm sure, and from East Anglia. So well done. I drove down, and then I caught a train from Cambridgeshire, where I used to live. I couldn't get a train from Cumbria, but our chairman of trustees was a bit more resourceful and waylaid his at Lockerbie. So well done, Chris. Okay. I was asked to talk about me. Well, I find it much easier to talk about somebody else and another subject. So this will be a quick gander through what you've missed because you haven't been able to talk to me for 3 years. So sorry about this. Okay, let's start in the beginning. Well, I've been interested in plants for a long time. They fascinated me, and I used to collect a few because we could do that 75 years ago. And bring them home trying to work out. My mum used to work for a local seed merchant in Manchester, so she had a few clues. And then I was given a book, the Observer's Book of Wildflowers, but I knew most of those already, so I thought, yeah, it was very nice to be given a book. But I graduated onto Gaston Bonnier's Name That Flower, and that had keys in it. So that was the crucial thing, how to do your detective work, how to use the keys to take you to the next stage. And I went on holiday in North Wales because we didn't have a car, so it was where I could get to by train, and discovered many new plants. Those of you who are going to sleep, you can spot that. I think there are 4 typos. There are 4 typos in this presentation. So there you are, there's one here. At school, I went to an all-girls grammar school, but my biology teacher encouraged me, although she didn't know, neither did I, and I lived in Sale, adjacent to Manchester, about local natural history groups and societies, for which there were quite a lot. So that's something that, BSBI must rectify, local groups and putting people in touch. I wish I'd known about them because I wouldn't have just wandered about on my own for 18 years before discovering another group of people interested in plants. So then I watched ZooQuest on the telly. We got a telly. And I said to my mum, that's what I would like to do. And as you see, it seems I might have been a zoologist. And I had a Scotty dog, but I'm blonde hair, but I am afraid I'm not Charles Lindbergh Jr. So the careers mistress at school, who had been recently engaged, knew nothing about careers in science. And she didn't seem to know how to go about finding about careers in science. So my mum dragged me off in my school uniform, much to my embarrassment, into Manchester University to see Professor Valentine, who's one of our former presidents and eminent botanists. And he concluded, after lots of questions, that the Field Studies Council might suit me, because he said, if you walk along a trackway, are you the sort of person who says, oh, that's holly, and that's a blue butterfly there, and things, and and there's a bumblebee. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I like. So at that time, he said, Field Studies Council. Well, I filled in forms. Okay, I failed my chemistry A-level, right? So I didn't get in university the first go. So don't give up. Don't think that if you fail at the first hurdle, you can't get there in the end. And I filled in forms for the civil service. And I got offered an executive officer dealing with tax 3 miles down the road, and I thought about this, and Mum said, "Oh, it's quite a lot of money. You could live at home, and you could, you know." And I thought, that's not really what I want to do, age 18. So then I was lucky enough, about a month later, to get an invite to an interview at Monkswood Experimental Station. And I was interviewed for the job, and they took me outside and said, "Can you identify some of these plants?" And I said, "Oh, yes, yes. I'm quite happy with all these here." And I said, "But I don't know what that large thing is there in that enclosure." And it turned out to be Heracleum mantagasianum, which they were doing a study on, all that time ago as to how rare was it and where it was spreading. So it was in a sort of wire cage. Of course, it could easily escape from there. So I got the job, and I moved to Cambridgeshire. And I had no idea until then where Cambridgeshire was, because I had no car, never been out of the sort of north of England, but it was a whole new world, particularly because I met people who were interested in things like I was in the natural world, and you were able to go out with them and share things. So that was great. So that's Monkswood. That's the Biological Records Centre over there, which some of you will recognise. And that's where I came to live, in the tower. So that was a whole new world. Well, I was encouraged by my bosses, Terry Wells, Dry Wells, which more later, and Derek Wells, Wet Wells, to apply for university, because in order to get a bit further forward in my career, I really needed a degree, it seemed. So I got a place at the new University of Ulster, which was new. I was one of the pioneer students, so only 300 students, no societies, no halls of residence. We built a bar, we set up the film club, the chess club, the bridge club, the tennis club, the hockey club. So I didn't really spend much time studying the first couple of years, but it was thoroughly enjoyable. In the third year, while I was there, we had the Irish Troubles. So bombs going off in Coleraine and all around. But the university was left alone, and it was a kind of solace for people, whereas the people were thinking that students rioted and threw flour and milk at their shop windows on Rag Day, then and didn't think much of us then. They realised that the university was not being damaged by people for some reason or other. And so that became a refuge for all the local people to come in and share events and experiences. So that's what I learned a bit in Ireland. Much more than getting a university degree. I also met Mike Robinson, who was a zoology lecturer, and he was born in Manchester. He was the son of a bricklayer. He taught himself biology. He ended up going to study zoology with Nico Tinbergen at Oxford, and then he became a worker in the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. So when I talked to Mike, he said a biologist who's never been to the tropics has never lived. So lesson number 2, you save up. And he went back to Panama, and he became actually the head of the Smithsonian Research Institute throughout all of there. And I also went to see him in Papua New Guinea, and that's where I started to see my birds of paradise. After I graduated, I got a job in Dublin, working for Amphurus Forbacher. That means the National Institute of Physical Planning and Construction Research in English. It's easier to say in Irish. And I carried out surveys in the Midland counties. So Fiona, some of the sites that she showed us in Laois were recognisable to me, some of the species, which is good to see they're still there. And it was helping with landscape assessments and conservation issues as well. So it's quite a broad grounding. But I couldn't get a permanent job because I was a woman. I could, I think, probably in academia, have had a permanent post at that time. We're talking early 1970s here. But I could only get contract jobs, so I couldn't get a permanent job. So I loved Dublin, I loved Ireland, but I came back to Monkswood and to do a survey of a butterfly. Here you are, rare picture, graduation day. This is my mum and dad, no longer with me, of course. So I went back to Monkswood and did lots of contracts and waited for a job to come up. And so I applied and got the assistant to Dr. Perring in the Records Centre. And so I was there before Chris Preston, and I handed over to him a few years later. Well, I became there for many years. And I started to put records on computer, because we had them on pink cards, if anybody's seen these historic documents now, and handwritten lists. So that was the start. And everybody who knows me now will know I'm not very good at computing, but in those days, I saw the possibilities of it. And so with somebody who did know about computing, we started transferring that. So I wrote the Red Data book with Dr. Perring and helped with Fern Atlas. And I looked, the record card showed me that there were big gaps in our knowledge. And I thought, oh, well, perhaps I should get out of this record office and look at plants. And I chose some of the more interesting ones, including Leucodium aestivum, because that was a wet habitat. And I looked at the military orchid, which grew nearby in Suffolk at that stage. So, and I wrote up the floras. Then we had the split. The government took a hand in it, as it so often does. So it split us into the Nature Conservancy Council and the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology. And I had to choose. Well, I was interested in both elements. Would I do research? Would I do practical nature conservation and advice? And I chose the latter. So here I am with George Peterkin, who I also worked with at one time, looking at the snake's head fritillary in Wiltshire Meadow more recently. Here we are, historic document. The very first Red Data book in the world, okay? Not very exciting, very short, punchy things, no pictures. We do a bit better these days. Okay, then I joined the chief scientist team, and I had a smashing boss called Derek Ratcliffe, who's most of you will have heard of, I hope. And I knew about rare plants, but they said, oh, and by the way, you can take on lowland heathlands. And I thought, I don't know anything about lowland heathlands. So I became an overnight expert, because all our nature conservation people have been waiting for somebody to take on heathlands so that we didn't lose as many, because they were a threatened habitat, and still are. So that was quite interesting. So I had to go around and discover those. Right, so then I was handed the species recovery program, which we've seen about boom and sort of these things that are going on today, and the National Vegetation Classification. So this was a major project at that time, and I was responsible for bringing it through to fruition. So what I wanted to work with local people in a local area, rather than sit in. Some people said the people in Chief Scientist team sat in the ivory tower in Peterborough, and I didn't want to be like that. I wanted to go out and talk to actual people and work with them and work on local issues. So I went to Blackwell in the Lake District, and I also, after that, went to work in London for 3 months and commuting, and that was enough, 3 months commuting on a train, sitting in the same seat every morning, and if somebody else got on your seat, then you had to move, and wow, this was all a whole new world to me. It was all right, but I will say that I was offered to stay there for a few more years, that you could write the evidence, you could present it, you weren't allowed to draw conclusions, you had to lead the MPs. This was producing scientific rationales for the MPs. And you could, you know, the conclusion was as clear as anything, but they sometimes change their mind. Anyway, I moved on then to Scotland, and I ran the Natura, and when did I know about the BSBI? Well, that was when I was at Monk's Wood working for Terry Wells. And the threats of the Teesdale and Cow Green weather. And I joined the BSBI to help defend it because they were instrumental in setting up that defence. And I contributed a whole week's wages of £7 to the cause. I've become, as you can see, field meeting secretary and all these various things in the society because it's given me a rationale to work. I've enjoyed working with the people, a lot of you here today, and sharing experiences. Here's me checking records in a bothy on Mull, looking down the side of Mull, which is my vice county, Mull, Colin, Tyree. I produced a simple guide for visitors and locals because rather than the serious flora, which I am still hoping to get around to doing, because they wanted to know about what the plants they saw there. My last tetrad. Right, I thought about it and I've got a few achievements and I think most of all it's really sharing experiences and getting to know the British and more of the world flora with fellow people who share a passion for plants. The crucial factors were my encouraging parents, a good biology teacher, and I hope that you all recognise stages in this in your own lives. Meeting and working, as I've said, with fellow conservationists, and I put this amateur and professional mean there isn't a barrier to me, so the Irish experience I've spoken a little about. I could say more about that, but no time. Travel opportunities, certainly going abroad to the tropics, certainly seeing other flora and plants, British plants in other places, and vice versa. Taking opportunities, having a fantastic boss like Derek Ratcliffe, who was prepared to get out from behind his desk and the piles of papers and come out and help me record military orchid. Wet wells, well, there's a key to wells, the ACI, and some old BSBI newsletter, and I can't remember which one. Basically, one looked at wetlands, and the other looked at the chalk and the drier ones. So I also consulted, sort of ancient texts and things, and went across to Cambridge and talked to Darwin. I'm sure a lot of you have done this. And this is a picture of at Kew, and you probably recognise quite a few people here today when we celebrated David Pearman's contribution to the organisation a few years ago. And you can identify some of those at some time. Local societies were very important, the Natural History Society, and also working in Europe with Plant Europa and Plant Life. So most of all, we're nearly there, I cannot remember a time when I wasn't really fascinated by plants, their colour and their shape and their form, and trying to understand them and just simply appreciate them. And they certainly got me through lockdown because I set off to do a survey of fingered sedge for my house when I discovered there was a lot of it around Arnside. And that was great. Over to the future. So over to Michelin, and where might I go? So Michelin, here you are. This is you a few years ago, clearly getting into practice for what you're going to be doing for the next 2 years. So I might be in a boat visiting some far-flung island, or I might be sitting on top of a hilltop somewhere in Slovenia or other parts of Europe, if I can get there. And I really would like to say thank you to all helping me and supporting me through the past 3 years, and even longer, perhaps over the last 70-odd years. So thank you very much.